Good morning. I will be reviewing Jesper Juul's Half Real, video games between real rules and fictional worlds. In his previous work, Juul argued that within the world of video games, that rules and fiction should be envisioned as two separate entities. But in this text, he makes a radically different argument. In it, he presents gameplay as an interaction of real rules within a fictional sphere, and contends that what emerges from the interaction is one of the key elements of video game construction, appeal, and playability. Early on in the text, Juul offers the classic game model, his own creation, as a means of understanding 5,000 years of game construction and play. But it seems that he constructed this model in part to provide a platform from which to leap, for he suggests that the emergence of new game forms during the last half of the 20th century have undermined some of the tenets of the model, and that certain classifications of video games have simply evolved beyond its limitations. He contends that games are created and played using different tools, and by virtue of the fact that games are transmedial, that computers are merely an example of a particular game medium, no different than a chessboard or a basketball court. In order to address some of these limitations, Juul introduced a new, more comprehensive definition of games, contingent on the following 6 key features. A game is a rule-based system with a variable and quantifiable outcome, where different outcomes are assigned different values. The player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels emotionally attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are negotiable. The last feature comes from the realization that all games are potential targets from betting and or professional play, which is a real-world consideration. So, armed with this definition, Juul explores various aspects of video game aesthetics as he contemplates the psychological interactions at play when a player truly engages with or surrenders to a game. His entire premise can arguably be reduced to the intersection between games as rule, games as fiction, and the relation between the game, the player, and the world. Although it may seem paradoxical, Juul argues that rules are the most consistent source of player enjoyment in games, because in games we tend to submit to rules voluntarily. In fact, for most games, the strategies needed to play, otherwise known as player ingenuity, are more complex than the rules themselves. But in simple games, player ingenuity can actually undermine their enjoyment. Juul uses the example of tic-tac-toe to demonstrate how a game's enjoyment can be undermined when the player is able to identify the strategic patterns that influence or determine the outcome. For example, if your opponent begins in the middle of the tic-tac-toe board, a sophisticated player will counter by always picking a corner. Juul asserts that having this knowledge, in effect, exhausts one's interest in the game, for it can no longer offer a challenge. The text makes the distinction between games of emergence and games of progression. Think of games of emergence as the primordial game structure, a number of simple rules combining to yield a large number of interesting variations. So this could be cards, board games, even sports. But in games of progression, players have to perform a predefined set of actions in order to complete the game. As such, the locus of control is shifted from the player to the game designer, since it is the game designer that controls the sequence of events. This structure of game is historically newer, often has storytelling ambitions, and is associated mainly with adventure games. It is interesting to note that Juul is unwilling to concede the point that a well-formed narrative is needed to improve the player's experience, instead favoring the idea that because fictional worlds are first projected by game designers and then imagined by players, that the player's perception simply fills in the gaps left by the designer, thereby making the experience a highly subjective one. It appears that Half Real which the author jokes could just as easily be entitled half fictional, was written in part to bring greater attention to the increased role of fiction in video games and the mechanisms at play that serve to communicate and enforce shared rules while still sustaining player interest. Beyond the player and the game, it is clear that Juul also sees the world through its conventions, knowledge, and the injection of consequences as a major player in influencing these interactions.